You know what they say about gardens, don't they? That they require patience, dedication, and above all, trust in the soil beneath your feet. I learned the hard way that some soil is poisoned from the roots up, and sometimes the very hands that should nurture you are the ones mixing the poison. My name is Ethel Morrison, and I'm here to tell you Margot Hayes' story. I've been her neighbor for 37 years. Watched her boys grow from scrape-knee children into men I no longer recognized, and held her hand through the darkest days any mother could endure. What happened to Margot, what her own flesh and blood did to her and to Ernest, it changed everything I thought I knew about family, about love, about the terrible things people will do when greed takes root in their hearts. This isn't an easy story to tell, but Margot asked me to share it, to let the world know what happened on Maple Street in Spring Creek, in a modest yellow house with blue shutters where a murder was planned over, Sunday dinners and carried out with coffee and false smiles. So settle in. This is the story of how two sons killed their father and plotted to kill their mother, and how one widow found the courage to send her own children to prison for the rest of their lives. It starts. As these things often do with what looked like love, Margot Hayes met Ernest when she was barely 19. Working the register at Murphy's General Store on the edge of Spring Creek, he'd come in every Tuesday for cigarettes and milk, always had a joke ready, always made her laugh even on the slowest, most mind-numbing shifts. Ernest wasn't rich, wasn't particularly handsome by magazine standards, but he had kind eyes and calloused hands that knew hard work. When he asked her to marry him 6 months later, she said yes without hesitation. They were married in the spring of 1963, in a ceremony so small you could count the guests on 2 hands. No honeymoon, no fancy reception. Just 2 young people promising forever to each other in a world that demanded everything and gave back so little. For 42 years, they kept that promise. 42 years of modest living, of making every dollar stretch, of sacrifice and small joys. Ernest worked as a mechanic, running a tiny repair shop out of a converted garage. The hours were long, the pay was never quite enough, but he took pride in his work. He'd come home smelling of motor oil and metal, his fingernails permanently darkened with grease, and Margot would have dinner waiting. Nothing fancy, meatloaf, casseroles, the kind of meals that fed a family without breaking the bank. They had 2 sons. Charles came first in 1965, with Ernest's dark hair and Margot's sharp chin. Henry followed 3 years later, lighter-haired, quieter, always in his older brother's shadow. Margot loved those boys with every fiber of her being. She packed their lunches every morning, mended their clothes, sat up with them through fevers and nightmares. Ernest taught them about engines and integrity, about doing an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. But somewhere along the way, the boys learned to be ashamed. It started small. Charles, at 14, lying about what his father did for a living, telling his friends Ernest was a business consultant instead of a mechanic. Henry refusing to let his classmates drop him off at home, getting out 2 streets over and walking the rest of the way. By the time they were teenagers, you could see the distance growing, the embarrassment settling in like rot and old wood. Margot tried not to take it personally. Teenagers, she told herself, they'll grow out of it. But they never did. Charles went to community college, then transferred to a state university on loans he'd spent decades trying to repay. He studied business administration, came home for holidays less and less frequently, and when he did visit, he'd spend the whole time on his phone, checking emails, making it clear he had better places to be. Henry followed a similar path, studying finance, landing a job at a bank that paid well enough, but never quite well enough for the lifestyle he craved. Both boys wanted more. More money, more status, more everything, and they looked at their parents' modest yellow house with its sagging porch and aging furniture, and all they could see was failure. When Charles married Jasmine at 32, it was clear from the start that she'd married beneath her station. Jasmine came from money, real money, the kind that buys third homes and yearly European vacations. She wore her wealth like armor, and she wielded her condescension like a sword. The few times she visited Margot and Ernest's home, she'd perch on the edge of the sofa like she was afraid poverty might be contagious, checking her watch every 10 minutes, making pointed comments about the outdated decor, and the smell of Ernest's shop wafting through the windows. Charles changed after marrying her. Or maybe he just stopped hiding who he'd become. He stopped calling except on obligatory holidays. Stopped visiting unless Jasmine absolutely insisted on maintaining appearances. And when he did show up, he'd look at his father with something close to contempt. At the grease under Ernest's nails, at the simple meals Margot served, at the life his parents had built brick by modest brick. Henry wasn't married, but he'd accumulated debts trying to look like he was worth marrying. Designer suits he couldn't afford, a car with payments that ate half his paycheck, an apartment in a building where the lobby had a doorman and a fountain, but the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors breathe. He was drowning in $40,000 of debt, and pride wouldn't let him admit it, wouldn't let him scale back, wouldn't let him ask for help from parents he'd spent his adult life pretending not to know. Charles had it worse. $70,000 in debt between credit cards and the business venture that had collapsed before it started, and a wife whose spending habits could bankrupt a small nation. He was desperate, the kind of desperate that makes men do terrible things. And then, sometime in the spring, the boys started visiting more often. Margot was thrilled at first. She told me over the back fence, her face lit up like a girl's, how Charles and Henry were coming by every weekend, sometimes twice a week, bringing groceries, offering to help with repairs around the house, actually sitting and talking with their father about his work. She thought they'd finally grown up, finally realized that family mattered more than money or status. Ernest wasn't so sure. He mentioned it to me once, standing in my driveway while I watered the petunias, his voice low and worried. Said the boys kept asking about his life insurance, about his health, about whether he'd considered increasing his coverage now that he was getting older. Said it felt off, like they were building up to something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. I told him he was being paranoid. I told him to enjoy having his sons back in his life. I told him a lot of things I wish I could take back now. Ernest didn't let it go, though. He had good instincts, Ernest did. Came from years of diagnosing engine problems by sound alone, by the feel of a vibration, by trusting his gut when something wasn't right. And his gut was screaming so he hired a private investigator. Stephen Callahan, a former police detective who'd gone private after 20 years on the force. Ernest didn't tell Margot, didn't want to worry her, didn't want to poison her relationship with her sons over what might turn out to be nothing but an old man's paranoia. Stephen started surveillance in June. He placed recording devices in the living room, in the kitchen, tiny things no bigger than a button that picked up every word. He photographed the boys coming and going, documented their visits, tracked their movements. And what he found would break Margot's heart into pieces. So small, she'd never put them all back together. Charles and Henry were planning to kill their father. The recordings were damning. Charles's voice, cold and calculated, laying out the plan like he was presenting a business proposal. Henry, weaker, hesitant, but ultimately agreeing. They talked about money, about insurance payouts, about how they'd split the proceeds. 70-30, Charles insisted because he had more debt and because the plan was his idea. Henry argued for 50-50. They compromised on 60-40. They talked about their father like he was a problem to be solved. an obstacle between them and solvency. Never once did either of them express guilt or hesitation beyond the practical concerns of getting caught. Never once did they call him Dad. The plan was simple, elegant in its cruelty. Methanol poisoning administered slowly over weeks in Ernest's morning coffee. They'd researched it thoroughly. Methanol, the same stuff in antifreeze and fuel additives, would cause symptoms similar to a heart attack or stroke. Confusion, headaches, breathing problems. By the time anyone figured out what was really wrong, it would be too late. And they'd already bribed a doctor. A man named Philip Grayson, who had lost his license once before for insurance fraud and was working at a sketchy urgent care clinic on the wrong side of town. He'd sign whatever death certificate they needed, no questions asked, for $5,000 cash. But Ernest and Margot were just the first phase. The recordings revealed a second plan, colder and more patient than the first. Once Ernest was dead and the insurance money collected, they'd wait 6 months, maybe a year, let Margot grieve, let her guard down. Then they'd do it again. Margot's death would look like grief, like a widow who couldn't live without her husband. Another small insurance payout, another problem solved. And then all the money would be theirs, and they could finally live the lives they deserved. The lives their parents' poverty had denied them. Charles even joked about it on one of the recordings, his voice light, almost playful. Said that Margot would probably thank them if she knew that she'd been miserable for years anyway, trapped in that house with a man who smelled like motor oil and a life that went nowhere. Henry laughed. Not a full laugh, but enough. Enough to prove he was complicit. Enough to prove he'd stopped thinking of her as his mother and started thinking of her as a means to an end. Stephen Callahan documented everything. Every conversation. Every visit. Every time Charles brought coffee beans from that expensive place downtown. The ones he claimed were a gift, but were really just a cover. A reason for the coffee to taste different when they started adding the poison. They started in late July. Just a little at first. Testing, making sure Ernest wouldn't notice. He didn't. Or if he did, he attributed it to stress, to age, to the long hours in the shop. He started getting headaches, feeling dizzy in the mornings. Margot wanted him to see a doctor. Ernest said he would after he finished the brake job on the Henderson's truck. After he got caught up on work, after by August, he was worse. The dizziness had progressed to confusion, to moments where he'd lose time, forget where he was. His vision blurred. His hands trembled. Margot was terrified, begging him to go to the hospital, but Ernest was stubborn. He didn't trust doctors, didn't want to spend money they didn't have on tests that probably wouldn't find anything anyway. Charles and Henry visited 3 times a week now. Always solicitous, always concerned. They'd bring groceries, bring coffee, sit with their father and talk about old times while the poison accumulated in his system. Stephen's recordings caught them discussing dosage, debating whether to increase the amount, worried that it was taking too long, and that Margot might insist on medical intervention before the job was finished. On August 15th, Ernest collapsed in his shop. Margot found him an hour later, unconscious on the concrete floor, his breathing shallow and irregular. She called an ambulance, rode with him to County General, held his hand while the doctors ran tests, and came back with expressions that meant nothing good. They said it was his heart. Said he'd had a massive cardiac event, probably stress-related, probably compounded by years of physical labor and poor diet. They stabilized him, put him in the ICU, told Margot to prepare for the worst. Charles and Henry were there every day, playing the part of devoted sons. They brought Margot coffee from the hospital cafeteria, sat with her in the waiting room, held her when she cried. And every night, they'd step outside to make phone calls. And Stephen Callahan would be there with his equipment, recording every word. They were frustrated. The hospital was interfering, keeping Ernest alive when he should have died already. They debated whether to try to finish the job in the hospital, maybe slip something into his four, but decided it was too risky. Better to wait. Better to let nature take its course. Ernest died 5 days later, on August 20th, at 3:47 in the morning. Margot was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head on his chest, when his heart finally stopped. She woke to the sound of the monitor flatlines, to the nurses rushing in, to the terrible certainty that the man she'd spent 42 years loving was gone. Dr. Grayson signed the death certificate the next day. Cause of death: acute myocardial infarction secondary to work-related accident and stress. The hospital accepted it without question. Why wouldn't they? Ernest was 66, had worked hard his whole life, had presented with all the symptoms of heart failure. The story made sense. The funeral was on August 24th. Small, like the wedding had been. Margot chose Ernest's best shirt, the one he wore to Charles's wedding, and a tie she'd given him for their 40th anniversary. She placed his wedding ring in his pocket, along with a photograph of the two of them from their honeymoon. Young and hopeful and so terribly naive about what the world would take from them, Charles gave a eulogy, stood up there in his expensive suit, and talked about what a great father Ernest had been, how he'd taught them the value of hard work and integrity, how he'd sacrificed everything for his family. Henry cried, or pretended to. Margot sat in the front pew, surrounded by neighbors and old friends, and believed every word. Believed her sons were grieving. Believed she wasn't alone. The text messages started during the reception at the funeral home. Margot's phone buzzed. She ignored it at first, too numb to care about anything beyond getting through the next minute, the next hour. It buzzed again. And again, the messages were from an unknown number. The first one said, "Mrs. Hayes, you're in danger. Don't trust your sons." Margot stared at it, her heart suddenly racing. A sick joke, she thought. Some cruel person's idea of humor. She deleted it. The next message came immediately. "This is Stephen Callahan. Your husband hired me. He was murdered. Check your email." Margot's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Around her, people were eating finger sandwiches and sharing memories of Ernest, and her entire world was tilting sideways. She checked her email. There were files from an address she didn't recognize. Audio files, documents, photographs. The subject line read, "Ernest Hayes investigation, urgent." She couldn't open them there. Couldn't let anyone see the panic spreading through her chest like ice water. She made excuses, said she needed air, stumbled outside into the August heat, and leaned against the brick wall of the funeral home, her phone clutched in both hands. The first audio file was dated June 7th. Charles's voice, clear as day. "We need to act soon." The old man's getting suspicious, asking why we're suddenly so interested in his insurance. "We need to move before he figures it out." Henry's voice, "You're sure about this?" "It's our father, Charles. He's a means to an end. Nothing more. You want to spend the rest of your life buried in debt, living in that shoebox apartment, watching everyone else succeed? Or do you want the life you deserve?" Margot listened to the whole thing. 47 minutes of her sons planning to murder their father, discussing methods, calculating payouts, laughing. She vomited in the bush behind the funeral home. Vomited until there was nothing left. Until she was dry heaving and crying and making sounds she didn't recognize as her own. Then she went back inside, composed herself, and got through the rest of the reception without screaming. The next week was a blur of terrible discoveries. Margot, with Stephen Callahan's help, started digging into everything Ernest had suspected but couldn't prove. The bank records showed unauthorized withdrawals going back to July. Small amounts at first, then larger. Charles had gotten access to Ernest's account using a forged power of attorney. $15,000 had been siphoned off over 6 weeks, carefully timed to avoid triggering fraud alerts. The insurance policy had been changed 3 months before Ernest's death. The coverage had been increased from $50,000 to $200,000, with Charles and Henry listed as beneficiaries. Ernest's signature on the documents was forged, a decent job but not perfect. Margot got a handwriting expert to confirm it. There was no police report of any shop explosion or work accident, nothing to support the cause of death on the certificate. When Margot called the fire department, they had no record of any incident at Ernest's shop. When she drove by the place, everything looked normal. No damage. No signs of any accident at all. She requested Ernest's medical records from County General. The attending physician there, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had noted concerns about Ernest's presentation. The symptoms didn't quite match a typical heart attack. She'd ordered a toxicology screen, but it had been canceled before processing. Canceled by Dr. Grayson, who'd pulled rank somehow. Claimed he was the family physician and would handle the final determination, Stephen. Callahan tracked down 2 witnesses who'd seen Charles buying large quantities of methanol from an automotive supply store in July. Paid cash. Gave a fake name, but the security cameras caught him, and the manager remembered the transaction because Charles had been nervous, aggressive when asked questions about what he needed it for. Margot did the math. Her husband had been murdered for $200,000. $120,000 for Charles, $80,000 for Henry. That's what 42 years of marriage and fatherhood was worth to them. That's what her life was worth because she knew with sick certainty that she would have been next. She could have kept quiet. Could have taken the insurance money, small as it was compared to what the boys would have gotten, and lived out her remaining years in peace. Could have pretended she didn't know that her sons were still the babies she'd nursed and raised and loved. But Ernest's voice was in her head, the way he'd sounded on his deathbed, confused and scared, asking her why his coffee tasted strange, why his boys kept bringing him coffee when he'd never been much of a coffee drinker before. She'd dismissed it as delirium. Now she knew it was the last piece of awareness, the last gasp of a man realizing, too late, what was being done to him. Margot went to the police on September 3rd. Walked into the Spring Creek Police Department with a folder full of evidence, with Stephen Callahan beside her, and asked to speak to a detective. She sat across from Detective Amanda Rhodes and laid it all out. The recordings, the financial records, the forged documents, the toxicology concerns, everything. Detective Rhodes listened, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When Margot finished, there was a long silence. Then Rhodes said, "Mrs. Hayes, I want to be clear about what you're saying. You're accusing your sons of murdering your husband and planning to murder you. If we investigate this and find evidence to support it, they'll be arrested. They'll go to trial. If convicted, they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" Margot thought about Charles at 7, climbing into her lap during thunderstorms. Henry at 5, bringing her dandelions from the yard and calling them flowers for the prettiest mommy. The boys she'd raised, the men they'd become. The distance between those 2 things, vast and unbridgeable. "I'm certain," she said, that the exhumation happened on September 10th. They dug up Ernest's casket from Spring Creek Cemetery and transported it to the state medical examiner's office. The toxicology report came back 3 days later. Lethal levels of methanol in his system, concentrated in his liver, his blood, his brain. No question about the cause of death. No question that it was murder. Charles and Henry were arrested on September 15th. Simultaneous raids, coordinated by state police to prevent either one from fleeing or destroying evidence. Charles was taken from his office at the consulting firm where he'd been working, walked out in handcuffs in front of all his colleagues. Henry was arrested at home, still in his pajamas at noon, which tells you something about where his mental state had been since his father's funeral. The trial was the next spring. 6 months of legal proceedings, of motions and counter-motions, of defense attorneys trying to poke holes in what everyone knew was an airtight case. The prosecution presented the recordings, the financial evidence, the toxicology reports, the witnesses. Stephen Callahan testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through every piece of evidence he'd gathered. Dr. Grayson had already flipped, cut a deal to testify against the boys in exchange for a reduced sentence on his own charges. He laid out exactly how they'd approached him, how much they'd paid him, what they'd asked him to falsify. He cried on the stand, said he was sorry, said he'd been desperate. No one was impressed. Margot testified too. Sat in the witness box and looked at her sons, really looked at them for the first time since discovering the truth. Charles stared back, defiant, angry, like she was the one who'd betrayed him. Henry couldn't meet her eyes, just stared at his hands at the defense table, anywhere but at the woman who'd given him life. The prosecutor asked her to describe her relationship with Ernest, with her sons. Asked her what she'd felt when she'd learned the truth. Margot's voice was steady. She talked about the 42 years, about the love that had sustained them through poverty and hardship, about the boys she'd raised, the men she thought they'd become, about the moment she'd listened to that first recording and felt her entire world collapse. "Do you still love your sons, Mrs. Hayes?" The prosecutor asked. Margot was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I love the children they were, but I don't know these men. These men killed my husband. These men planned to kill me. Whatever love I had for them died with Ernest." The jury deliberated for 4 hours, came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. First-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, forgery. The judge sentenced them to life without possibility of parole for 30 years. Jasmine divorced Charles before the sentencing, took what was left of their assets and disappeared. Margot heard she'd moved to California, married someone else, never spoke about her first husband or what he'd done. Charles committed suicide in prison 9 months into his sentence. Hung himself in his cell with a bedsheet. The prison called Margot to inform her. She thanked them and hung up. Didn't cry. Didn't feel much of anything, really. Just a distant sadness for the waste of it all. For the bright little boy who'd grown into a man capable of such darkness. Henry had a mental breakdown. Complete dissociation from reality. Last Margot heard, he was in the psychiatric wing of the state prison, medicated into a fog, barely aware of where he was or what he'd done. Some people said it was guilt eating him alive. Margot thought it was cowardice. Couldn't face what he'd become, so his mind just checked out. The insurance money came through eventually. $200,000 blood money, stained with Ernest's last confused moments and her son's betrayal. Margot couldn't keep it. Couldn't spend a penny of it. Couldn't let it sit in her account, poisoning everything it touched. She established the Ernest Hayes Foundation for Victims of Family Crimes. Used every cent to help other families who'd been betrayed by their own blood, who needed lawyers or investigators or just someone to believe them when they said their loved ones' deaths didn't add up. Stephen Callahan served on the board, helped run investigations pro bono for families who couldn't afford to pay. 5 years later, Margot lives in the same yellow house with blue shutters on Maple Street. She's 71 now, her hair completely white, her hands spotted with age. But she's still strong, still sharp. Still standing. She turned Ernest's old shop into a garden. Tore out the engine blocks and oil stains, brought in soil and flowers and vegetables. She works out there every morning, the way Ernest used to work on engines. Says it helps her feel close to him, helps her remember that there was love in this world, real love, before it was poisoned. Every Sunday, she visits Ernest's grave, brings fresh flowers, sits on the grass beside the headstone, and tells him about her week, about the families the foundation has helped, about the garden. Sometimes she cries. Sometimes she just sits in silence, her hand on the cool marble, connected to him in the only way still available. She's helped 37 families through the foundation. 37 other people who had their worlds shattered by those they should have been able to trust. Some found justice. Some didn't. But they all found someone who believed them, who understood that family can be the most dangerous thing in the world when greed replaces love. I see Margot over the back fence sometimes, the way I always have. We don't talk about Charles and Henry much anymore. There's nothing left to say, really. The story is what it is, terrible and complete. But she'll tell me about the tomatoes coming in, about the family in Ohio whose case the foundation just took on, about the hummingbirds that nest in the garden every spring, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun is setting and the air smells like honeysuckle and turned earth, I'll see her standing in the garden, surrounded by growing things, and I'll think about how some people survive the unsurvivable, how some people find the strength to tear up the poison roots and plant something new, how justice isn't about healing because some wounds never heal. It's about refusing to let evil win. Even when evil shares your last name and your blood and your history, Margot Hayes lost her husband, lost her sons, or the men they became, lost the future she'd imagined for her family. But she didn't lose herself, didn't let the betrayal make her bitter or broken. She took the worst thing that could happen to a mother, to a wife, and turned it into something that might help others avoid the same fate. That's the story. That's what happened on Maple Street, in a modest house where a family fell apart from greed and pride, and the terrible belief that some lives are worth more than others. That's what Margot wants the world to know, that evil can come from anywhere, even from the people you raised and loved. That justice matters, even when it costs you everything. That some gardens grow from ashes, and sometimes that's the most beautiful thing of all. I think about Ernest sometimes, about what he'd make of it all, about the garden where his shop used to be, about the foundation bearing his name, about the way Margot honors his memory not with grief but with action. I think he'd be proud. I think he'd say she did the right thing, the only thing. That 42 years of love matters more than 2 sons who forgot what love means. And I think about Charles and Henry, though I try not to. Think about the moment they made the choice, the moment they looked at their father and saw not a person but a dollar amount. How does that happen? How do you love someone as a child and learn to hate them as an adult? How do you forget that every person starts as someone's baby, someone's hope, someone's whole world? I don't have answers, just the story. Just the garden growing where a murder was planned, and the woman who tends it, and the memory of a man who worked with his hands and loved with his whole heart and died, wondering why his coffee tasted strange. That's all any of us leave behind in the end. Stories, gardens, the choices we make when everything is on the line. Margot chose justice over her children. Ernest chose suspicion over trust and saved his wife's life even after his own ended. And somewhere in Spring Creek Cemetery, under a marble headstone, a mechanic rests knowing that his final case, the one he couldn't solve in life, was solved by the only person who mattered, the woman who loved him for 42 years, the woman who still does.